Here's a thoughtful and engaging draft for your video introduction. Imagine this: a dimly lit gym, the smell of sweat and determination hanging in the air, and the rhythmic thud of gloves meeting heavy bags echoing like a heartbeat. The camera pans across the room, catching the glint of a UFC Championship belt resting on a bench, a symbol of victory, grit, and endless hours of training. Sitting beside it is Marcus, the Hammer Jones, a man whose fists have turned him into a living legend in the octagon. He's calm but focused, wrapping his hands as if preparing for the fight of his life. But tonight isn't about a cage match. Tonight, Marcus faces a very different kind of opponent, one he's never encountered before. Enter Officer Brad Hayes, a local cop known for his towering frame and an aura of confidence that borders on cocky. Brad isn't your average police officer. He's built like a linebacker and spends his off-duty hours competing in amateur wrestling tournaments. He's heard the chatter. Can Marcus, a UFC champion trained in striking and grappling, take down someone like him? Quick, powerful, and unrelenting, outside the octagon. What starts as a casual bet between two men quickly spirals into something much bigger. The question is simple yet electrifying. Can a trained UFC fighter, with all the precision of years of elite-level coaching, outmaneuver and pin down someone who represents raw, unrefined strength and the unpredictable tactics of real-world law enforcement? And can he do it in under a minute? The rules are clear: no strikes, just grappling. A test of skill versus instinct. As the gym buzzes with excitement, a small crowd gathers. Other fighters, gym trainers, and a few curious onlookers who can't resist the allure of an unsanctioned clash between two alpha personalities. The clock is set for 1 minute. Marcus stretches, his muscles taut and ready, while Brad adjusts his stance, a smirk playing on his lips. Both men radiate confidence, but beneath the surface, there's an unspoken tension. This isn't just about bragging rights. It's about proving something. Marcus defending his title as an elite combat athlete, and Brad showing that real-world toughness isn't something you can teach in a gym. The camera zooms in on Marcus's face. He's all focused now, his mind running through years of training, every hold encounter running like a mental highlight reel. Across from him, Brad cracks his knuckles and shifts his weight, his imposing figure a stark contrast to Marcus's lean, calculated presence. And then, with a sharp clap and a countdown, the challenge begins. But just as they lock up, there's a moment, a flicker of something unexpected. Marcus, with his years of training, sees an opening that could end this in seconds. But Brad, with his raw instinct, counters in a way that nobody saw coming. The crowd gasps. The clock ticks. 59 seconds left. Will Marcus's experience outshine Brad's brute strength? Or will Brad's unpredictable style prove to be Marcus's Achilles heel? Stay tuned, because what happens next might just shatter every assumption you've ever had about fighting, strategy, and what it really takes to win. The tension in the gym was suffocating. You could hear every footstep, every breath, as the crowd watched with bated breath. They were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to something bigger, something unpredictable. Marcus and Brad, two very different men with two very different approaches to strength and combat, were locked in a battle of wills. The clock was ticking down, and the stakes had only grown higher. This wasn't just about who could take down the other in under a minute. This was about proving something far deeper, something intangible. Marcus felt his muscles burning. His body was used to the relentless pace of professional fighting, but this was different. Brad was strong, yes, but it wasn't just his power that kept him in the game. It was his ability to think on his feet, to move in ways that Marcus wasn't used to. In the octagon, everything had rules, boundaries, predictability. But here in this small gym, with a random assortment of people watching, there were no rules. Brad's unpredictability was starting to break through Marcus's composure. It was a fight he wasn't entirely prepared for, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the edge of doubt creeping in. His breathing slowed as he tried to focus. There was a brief moment where time seemed to stand still. The gym was eerily quiet, save for the sound of feet shifting across the mat and the sharp exhales of two men who were running on sheer willpower. Marcus knew he had to make his move now, before Brad's raw energy overpowered his technique. But the more he tried to focus, the more he felt the weight of the clock pressing on him. Brad wasn't just holding on anymore. He was adjusting, adapting in ways Marcus hadn't expected. His movements, once erratic, were now becoming more controlled, more deliberate. It was as if he was learning from Marcus's every move, countering and shifting in ways that took the champion by surprise. Marcus's mind raced through every grappling technique he knew, every way to break free, every way to escape this hold. But Brad's grip was firm, and every time Marcus thought he had a moment to escape, Brad would tighten his hold just enough to keep him from slipping away. The crowd, too, was becoming restless. People were leaning forward, their faces strained, their eyes glued to the two men on the mat. Whispers filled the room, some in disbelief at how long Brad had held out, others speculating whether Marcus was actually starting to tire. A few spectators had placed bets, some on Marcus, expecting a swift victory, and others on Brad, driven by the raw power and unexpected energy he brought to the fight. In the back of the gym, Coach Hernandez, who had worked with Marcus for years, stood with his arms crossed, a frown on his face. He had trained Marcus for this exact moment, the ability to outlast, outfight, and outthink anyone, no matter their background. But even he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He'd never seen Marcus so pushed, so unsure. Brad wasn't just fighting physically, he was fighting mentally. And it was starting to show. Brad, for his part, was focused. His eyes were locked on Marcus, watching his every move. There was no need for fancy techniques here, no need for finesse. It was about raw power, heart, and instinct. He'd been in tough situations before, situations where he had to rely on his strength and will to push through. This wasn't about proving who was better at grappling or who had the better technique. This was about grit, about proving that sometimes strength didn't come from the body. It came from the mind, the will to endure when everything around you told you to quit. His thoughts were sharp, but his body was starting to feel the strain. Brad's arms were growing heavy from holding Marcus down, and sweat poured down his face as he tried to maintain his advantage. But there was something about the way Marcus moved that made him hesitant. The way his body flowed, like water finding its way around obstacles. Every time he thought he had a solid grip, Marcus would slip through his fingers, using his agility to create just enough space to reset the positions. But then, with a sudden surge of strength, Brad pushed Marcus's shoulder down, slamming him back into the mat. For a moment, it seemed as though Marcus's entire strategy had faltered. Brad's chest heaved with exertion, his arms locking around Marcus's torso, his face grim as he fought to maintain control. Marcus could feel the pressure, the weight of Brad's body on top of him, and it was becoming harder to breathe, harder to move. The clock was ticking down, and his window of opportunity was closing fast. The spectators gasped. This was not what they had expected. Some had already begun to lose faith in Marcus's ability to finish the match in the time limit. The undefeated champion, the one who had dominated every opponent, was struggling against a man who had no professional training, no background in tasks. The seconds continued to slip away. The tension in the gym became almost unbearable. Marcus's muscles screamed with fatigue, his every breath heavy and labored. He could feel the weight of Brad pressing down on him, his hands still locked around his torso, his body seemingly unyielding. But the more pressure Brad exerted, the more Marcus realized something. This wasn't a typical opponent. This wasn't someone who played by the rules, who would give in to technical finesse. Brad was unrefined, yes, but he was relentless, and there was something primal in his style that Marcus couldn't quite predict. Brad, for all his raw strength, was starting to feel the strain too. His arms, which had initially seemed so powerful, were beginning to tremble under the weight of holding Marcus down. He had never been in a position like this before, fighting someone so calculated, so precise. It was a constant mental battle, trying to keep up with Marcus's movements, trying to stay one step ahead. Brad had always relied on his power, on his ability to bulldoze through situations, but this wasn't a street brawl. It wasn't a wrestling match where size and strength dictated the winner. This was different, and the realization was starting to settle in. Marcus was not an ordinary fighter. The crowd, once enthusiastic and loud, had fallen into a stunned silence. Every eye was glued to the two men on the mat, no one daring to breathe too loudly in case they missed a pivotal moment. Some had placed bets, sure, but no one could have predicted how evenly matched these two would be. The wild card of this match wasn't just Brad's strength, it was his unpredictability. And that had put Marcus on edge from the start. Coach Hernandez shifted uncomfortably in the corner of the gym. For years, he had been Marcus's mentor, guiding him through grueling training sessions, preparing him for every imaginable scenario in the octagon. But this was something new, something raw. Even he didn't have a playbook for what was unfolding in front of him. His fighter, his champion, was in unfamiliar territory. Marcus had always thrived under pressure, but now even he was starting to feel the weight of the clock, the weight of expectation. From the sidelines, some of the gym regulars whispered quietly among themselves, some in disbelief, others in awe of Brad's endurance. A few had even started to second-guess their initial assumptions about the match. "I thought Marcus had this in the bag," one of the trainers muttered, leaning against the wall. "But Brad's holding his own. This is something else." "Yeah, no one expected him to last this long," another replied, eyes still fixed on the two men struggling on the mat. "Marcus is a beast, but Brad, he's fighting with something different. Not skill, but heart." It was true. What Brad lacked in technique, he made up for with sheer heart, with a mental toughness that came from years of being thrown into unpredictable, high-stress situations. In his line of work, there were no guarantees, no perfect plans. You had to act in the moment, rely on instinct and experience to carry you through. Brad had been in situations where his physical strength alone wasn't enough, where survival wasn't just about overpowering the other person. It was about outlasting them, forcing them to make mistakes, forcing them to burn out before you did. Brad had learned how to read people, how to anticipate their next move not through calculation, but through gut instinct. That same instinct was kicking in now, helping him anticipate Marcus's every attempt to break free. When Marcus shifted his weight, Brad would adjust. When Marcus tried to roll, Brad would counter. Every time it looked like Marcus might gain the upper hand, Brad would adjust his grip, his body positioning, making it harder for Marcus to get any leverage martial arts that Marcus had mastered. This wasn't the way they had imagined this fight going at all. But Marcus wasn't done. He wasn't going to let Brad or anyone dictate the outcome of this fight. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought against Brad's hold, his mind racing for the next move, the next opening. He had to keep his focus, had to remember everything he'd learned. This wasn't about proving he was the best fighter in the world. This was about proving that no matter the odds, no matter the challenges, he could find a way out. Brad had learned how to read people, how to anticipate their next move, not through calculation, but through gut instinct. That same instinct was kicking in now, helping him anticipate Marcus's every attempt to break free. When Marcus shifted his weight, Brad would adjust. When Marcus tried to roll, Brad would counter. Every time it looked like Marcus might gain the upper hand, Brad would adjust his grip, his body positioning, making it harder for Marcus to get any leverage. But even as the seconds ticked away and the fight grew more intense, there was a deeper, unspoken battle happening within both men. For Marcus, it wasn't just about winning this match. It was about proving something to himself. He had spent his entire career being the one others looked up to, the one who was always in control. But right now, he was fighting not just against Brad, but against his own limitations. He had never been in a situation like this before, where his skills didn't guarantee victory, where brute strength and unpredictability were his biggest challenge. For Brad, the stakes were just as high. This fight wasn't about beating Marcus. It wasn't about proving who was stronger or who could fight better. It was about something more personal, a chance to prove that the world didn't always recognize the value of his kind of strength. That it wasn't always about technique or polish, but about resilience, about the ability to endure. Brad had spent years watching people underestimate him. As a cop, he'd often been seen as just another big guy, another body on the force. But this fight was his opportunity to show that heart could sometimes be more valuable than skill. And as the clock continued to tick down, it became clear that neither man was going to give in easily. Marcus could feel the sweat stinging his eyes as he searched for any hint of an opening. His muscles screamed for relief, but he pushed forward, refusing to let the clock be his enemy. With every shift of Brad's body, with every adjustment he made, Marcus had to rethink his strategy, had to adapt. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. One wrong move, and the fight would be over. Brad, meanwhile, felt the weight of his own fatigue growing heavier with each passing second. His arms burned, his chest heaved with every breath. But the idea of giving up, it wasn't in him. Not now. Not after all he had fought through in his life. The job, the struggles, the times when he had been knocked down but always got back up. This was no different. If he could hold on just a little longer, if he could keep Marcus from escaping, then he could prove something that had haunted him for years. That he, too, could be the best at something, even if it wasn't in the way people expected. The gym was silent, the air thick with the unspoken tension that had built up over the past few minutes. As both men continued to struggle on the mat, it became clear that they were more than just fighters. They were symbols of something deeper. Two men from completely different walks of life, each pushing themselves beyond their limits, each fighting not just for victory, but for validation. And as the final seconds of the clock ticked down, neither man seemed willing to back off. Both were fighting not just to win, but to prove that their strength, whether it was through sheer technique or raw, unrefined power, was the one that would ultimately reign supreme. The audience waited, breathless, as the fight stretched into the final moments. What would happen next? Only time could tell. The final seconds on the clock seemed to stretch longer with every passing moment. Marcus's mind raced as he struggled beneath Brad's grip, his body screaming for relief, but he couldn't give in. He had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. He had never faced an opponent like Brad, someone who fought without the usual structure, without the discipline and control that Marcus had relied on for years. This wasn't just about strength. This was a battle of wills. Brad, too, could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. His arms were trembling, his breath ragged, and his muscles were beginning to betray him. But there was something inside him, something deeper than physical endurance, that kept him locked in the struggle. He wasn't about to let up now. Not after everything. Not after all the times he had been underestimated, dismissed. He was proving something bigger than himself in this fight. He could feel it in the way the crowd was watching, in the way the gym had fallen completely silent. Every eye was on them. And this moment, this fight, had become about more than just winning. It was about showing the world that he was more than what they thought. Marcus tried to shift his body again, attempting to break free, but Brad was like a stone on top of him, unyielding and relentless. The champion's eyes narrowed in concentration, his mind calculating every angle, every movement. But every time he thought he saw an opening, Brad would adjust. It was a game of cat and mouse, each man anticipating the other's next move, each knowing that the fight could end in an instant if the other made a mistake. Time was running out, and Marcus knew that every second counted. His heart pounded in his chest, his entire body throbbing with exhaustion, but his mind was still clear. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He had to get back on top. He had to end this. His years of training, of perfecting every move, every takedown, every submission, had to mean something now. But Brad wasn't making it easy. He wasn't the kind of fighter Marcus was used to. In the octagon, there was always a rhythm, a pace to follow. But Brad was a disruption, a whirlwind of energy and raw power that seemed impossible to predict. And Marcus knew that if he didn't act fast, the fight would slip away from him. The seconds ticked away on the clock, and the gym seemed to hold its breath. There was no sound, no chatter, no distractions. Just the heavy breathing of the two men locked in combat, the subtle shifts in their positions, the quiet rustle of sweat-soaked skin against the mat. It was as if the entire world had frozen around them. The only thing that mattered was the struggle taking place on the floor. Brad's grip was starting to falter. Marcus could feel it, the slightest looseness in Brad's hold, the smallest hint of hesitation. It was enough. With a burst of energy, Marcus twisted his body and surged upward, his movements swift and precise. For a moment, he felt like he might finally break free, that the fight was within his grasp. But just as he thought he had gained the upper hand, Brad shifted, using his body weight to press down harder than before. The air was thick with the effort, the sweat of two men fighting for everything they had. Brad's eyes were locked on Marcus, the determination clear in his gaze. He wasn't going to let go now. The clock was winding down, but there was no way he was giving up. Not when he could feel it in his bones. The victory was so close. Every part of his body screamed for him to relent, to ease up, to take a breath. But he couldn't. This was his chance, his moment to prove that his strength, raw, unrefined, but undeniable, could win out over the skill and precision of a professional fighter. The crowd was holding its collective breath, eyes wide, hands gripping the sides of their seats. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, as if everyone was on the edge of a cliff, waiting for that one final push, that one moment that would decide everything. Would Marcus break free and claim victory, as everyone expected? Or would Brad, against all odds, hold on and prove that he could take down the champion, showing that there was more to strength than just technique? Marcus could feel the end drawing near. He could feel his muscles protesting, his mind screaming for a way out. But he pushed through it. This was his moment. This was what he had trained for. Every day of discipline, every sacrifice, every fight he had ever been in, all of it had led to this. He wasn't going to lose to a man who didn't follow the rules, a man who didn't respect the structure he had built his life around. Brad's strength may have been formidable, but Marcus knew the fight wasn't over yet. Not until he decided it was. He shifted his weight, his body moving with precision as he attempted a move he had perfected in countless sparring sessions. But Brad's hold was firm, and for a moment, Marcus thought that maybe, just maybe, this was it. Maybe he had underestimated the power of pure will. Maybe this wasn't going to be his fight after all. Then, without warning, Brad's position faltered just slightly. A slight miscalculation, a slight change in balance. It was all Marcus needed. With everything he had left, he surged forward, pushing past the fatigue, pushing past the doubts, pushing past the pain. He drove forward like a coiled spring, his body snapping into action. Brad's grip loosened, and Marcus used the opportunity to break free, moving faster than he ever thought possible. The gym exploded into noise, gasps and shouts filling the air as Marcus scrambled to regain control. But Brad wasn't done, not by a long shot. The two men were locked in a fierce final struggle, each one pushing toward the finish line, each one desperate to come out on top. The seconds on the clock were ticking away, the tension building, the gym filled with the electric buzz of anticipation. The crowd knew it was coming. The final moment. The climax. The one move that would decide it all. But which man would make it first? Would it be the champion, the one who had spent years at the top? Or would it be the unexpected challenger, the man who had defied every expectation to make it this far? Just as Marcus seemed to have the upper hand, his momentum carrying him closer to victory, the room seemed to shift. The crowd's roar began to fade into an unsettling murmur, as if a strange unease had suddenly taken root. Marcus, focused on maintaining control, didn't notice the change right away. His eyes were locked on Brad, whose own gaze was fierce and unwavering, but there was something off in the air. It wasn't the usual energy of a fight reaching its final moments. It was as though something was about to derail everything. In that fleeting second, Marcus felt it. A sharp, excruciating pain shooting up his leg. The impact was so sudden and forceful that for a moment, he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, this time unmistakable. His vision blurred for a split second as he stumbled, his body twisting awkwardly as he tried to maintain his balance. What had just happened? He had been in countless intense situations before, but this was different. Brad, still grappling with him, seemed to notice the change too. His body stiffened, and for the briefest moment he hesitated. Marcus, now struggling to recover from the pain radiating in his leg, glanced down and saw it. A cut. A deep, jagged gash across his calf. The pain was sharp, a clear indication that something had gone terribly wrong. What had caused it? Marcus couldn't even remember feeling anything close to that pain during the fight. He thought back, but everything happened too fast, and the shock was too overwhelming. That's when he noticed Brad's hands. His grip had shifted. One of them was no longer clutching Marcus's body, but was instead digging into his leg, pulling at it in a way that felt deliberate. Marcus's pulse quickened as he realized what had happened. Brad had, somehow, slipped a hidden weapon into the fight. His fingers had scraped along the sharp edge of something, perhaps a hidden knife or some makeshift blade, deliberately and discreetly using it to cause a distraction. The blood pumping from Marcus's leg now felt like a cold warning. The fight had just escalated. What had been a struggle of pure will had now become a life-or-death fight, where the stakes had jumped higher than anyone in the gym had anticipated. The shock of the discovery hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. The fight had just shifted. He could still hear the murmurs of the crowd, but they now sounded distant, as if they were speaking from another world. Everything around him seemed to close in, the noise fading into a hollow echo. There was no turning back from this point. Brad had crossed a line. It wasn't just about strength anymore. It wasn't just about endurance or willpower. It was about survival. And Marcus knew that if he didn't act fast, he was in real danger. Brad, for a brief moment, seemed to notice that Marcus had caught on. His eyes flicked toward the injury on Marcus's leg, his expression shifting from one of primal determination to something far darker. It wasn't fear, it was the look of someone who knew the game had changed and was ready to take full advantage of it. Marcus, struggling to stay focused, took a shallow breath. The pain was nearly unbearable, but he couldn't let it control him. He had to keep moving. He had to keep thinking. His mind raced through possible options, trying to calculate his next move. The crowd was now murmuring louder, the atmosphere charged with uncertainty. No one had expected this, least of all Marcus. He had trained for every scenario he could imagine, every fight that could go wrong, every way his opponent could throw him off balance. But this was a game changer, and Marcus wasn't sure he could win it. Brad, sensing the shift in the air, took advantage of Marcus's brief disorientation. He tightened his grip once more, pulling Marcus toward him in a desperate attempt to secure his position. His hands, slick with sweat, held onto Marcus like a vice, but now there was a sense of urgency in his actions. Brad wasn't just fighting for victory anymore. He was fighting for something else, something darker. There was something in the way he moved now, something almost manic, as though he could taste the victory that had just been handed to him. Marcus's vision began to clear as he tried to push the pain to the back of his mind. His body was screaming at him, but his instincts were still sharp. Every movement was calculated, every shift of his body a reminder of what he had been trained to do. But now, his thoughts weren't just focused on Brad's strength or his unconventional tactics. They were centered on survival. The clock was ticking, and his body was betraying him. He had to find a way out of this, or it could all be over. In the midst of the struggle, something caught Marcus's eye. Just beyond the two of them, in the shadows of the gym, a figure moved. The audience seemed unaware of the interruption, absorbed in the fight that was playing out in front of them. But Marcus, now hyper-aware of every detail, saw it. A silhouette, moving too quickly, too quietly. Was it another person from the crowd? Had someone else joined the scene, or was it something else entirely? The figure's movements were too deliberate to be a bystander, and it sent a chill down Marcus's spine. But he couldn't afford to take his focus away from Brad. The man beneath him wasn't just trying to hold him down anymore. He was trying to finish him. Marcus could feel the pressure building as Brad continued to press harder, seemingly stronger now that he had made his move. The knife, or whatever weapon Brad had used, had shifted the dynamic. Marcus was no longer in a controlled fight. He was in the fight of his life. The seconds continued to tick down, and Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The stakes had just been raised to an unimaginable height. What had started as a battle of strength had morphed into something far more dangerous. The clock was ticking. Marcus's chances of winning were slim, slimmer than ever before. And with every passing second, the question hung heavier in the air. Could he survive this? The seconds on the clock were almost gone. Marcus could feel the sharp throb of pain in his leg with every breath, his body threatening to give in under the strain. But his willpower, instinctively honed over years of battling in the octagon, kept him going. The crowd's voices were growing louder, but to Marcus, everything seemed muffled. His focus narrowed to just one thing: Brad's hands, still locked onto his body, and the weapon they had hidden. Marcus knew he couldn't hold on for much longer. His leg was becoming numb, the blood seeping from the wound and slowing him down. He shifted his weight, trying to inch his way into a better position, but the pain was overwhelming. He couldn't keep fighting like this, not for much longer. Then, as if guided by instinct, His eyes locked once again on the figure in the shadows, the one he had noticed earlier. For a split second, Marcus felt a surge of confusion, wondering if he was hallucinating from the pain, but the figure was still there. And this time, it was clearer. The figure wasn't just standing idle. They were moving toward the ring, their steps deliberate and fast. The realization hit Marcus like a jolt. This wasn't just another bystander or curious onlooker. This person had a purpose. They were coming for him. Brad, too, seemed to notice the movement from the corner of his eye, but for a brief second, his grip tightened on Marcus's leg. He was too focused on the fight, too absorbed in the battle to consider any other potential threat. That moment of distraction was all Marcus needed. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, he twisted his body, using the last bit of strength he had to break free from Brad's clutches. Marcus pushed up, forcing himself to a kneeling position as the world around him seemed to explode into sound. The crowd had erupted into chaos, but Marcus's focus remained on the immediate danger. He couldn't get caught in a second hold. Not now. As he scrambled to his feet, he glanced quickly at Brad, whose expression was a mixture of disbelief and frustration. But before either of them could react, the figure from the shadows stepped into full view, and it was like the entire room fell silent. The gym lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow over the scene. The figure was a woman dressed in tactical gear, her face concealed behind a mask. She didn't speak, but her presence was commanding. And in her hand, there was a weapon, not the type of blade that Brad had concealed earlier, but a firearm pointed directly at Marcus. The crowd's shock was palpable. The gym seemed to hold its breath. Brad froze, his hands no longer on Marcus as his eyes widened in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" Brad muttered, his voice shaky. Marcus stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind racing. What had just happened? He had gone from thinking he was in control of his own fight to being caught in an entirely new kind of danger. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't even a fight anymore. It was something else entirely. The woman didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, the gun still trained on Marcus, and then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she spoke. "This fight is over." Her voice was calm but firm. There was no room for argument, no chance for a rebuttal. Brad looked from Marcus to the woman, confused and startled. His fists clenched, but he didn't move. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice strained with both confusion and exhaustion. The woman's eyes glinted from behind the mask, but she didn't offer any immediate answers. Instead, she reached for a small device on her belt and pressed a button. The lights in the gym flickered again, this time more erratically, as if the very air itself had been charged with an electric current. The moment the device clicked, the entire room seemed to shift. Seconds later, a sound, a deep, resonant thud, echoed through the gym. It wasn't just the gym anymore. The walls seemed to hum, the atmosphere vibrating in a way that made it impossible for anyone to focus. The tension that had built during the fight now felt almost irrelevant. Something much larger was unfolding. And then, as if the very ground beneath their feet had shifted, the gym doors burst open, and another set of figures entered the space. These weren't regular people. They moved with precision, their eyes scanning the room, their movements calculated. They were armed, just like the woman, but they weren't here to fight. They were here for something else. Something far more important than a simple contest of strength. The atmosphere in the gym turned cold. The crowd was now completely still, their eyes darting between the woman, the new arrivals, and the two fighters, who were now completely caught in this unknown scenario. Brad, still reeling from the sudden shift in events, turned to Marcus, his face full of confusion and anger. "This was never supposed to happen," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. But Marcus couldn't focus on Brad now. His mind was racing too fast. What had just happened? Who were these people? Why had they shown up now, in the middle of everything? Was the fight truly over? Or was this just the beginning of something even darker, even more dangerous than either of them could have imagined? As Marcus began to question everything that had led him to this moment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. He had always been in control of his fights, always planned for the unexpected. But this was something else entirely. And just as the room seemed to fill with a new tension, Marcus knew one thing for sure. There was far more at play here than just a fight between a UFC champion and a man trying to prove his worth. The tension in the gym hung thick in the air, as if the very walls themselves were waiting for the next move. Marcus stood there, his breathing shallow and uneven, his eyes fixed on the woman with the gun. The figures that had entered the gym were now surrounding the room, their eyes sharp and watchful, as though every single move they made was calculated and precise. Brad, still on the ground, looked from Marcus to the newcomers, his face a mask of confusion and anger. The woman with the gun didn't flinch. She was calm, collected, but there was something about her presence that made it clear she wasn't here for negotiation. She was in control, and whatever game they had been playing before, it was over. "Who the hell are you people?" Marcus finally managed, his voice strained but demanding. He couldn't help himself. He had to know. There were too many questions, too many unknowns, and he couldn't walk away from this fight until he had answers. The woman stepped forward, her boots making a soft thud against the gym floor. She didn't answer right away, her gaze shifting briefly to Brad before returning to Marcus. She seemed to study him, as though weighing her next words carefully. "You've been a part of something bigger than you think," she said, her voice steady, but with a hint of something darker beneath the surface. "Everything that's led to this moment, the fight, the stakes, the people involved, it's all been orchestrated. Not just for you, Marcus, but for others as well." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Everything had been a setup. He had been so focused on the physical contest, on the challenge Brad presented, that he hadn't even considered the possibility that there was something deeper going on. Brad, finally managing to push himself into a sitting position, turned to face the woman. "So what now?" His voice was low, and Marcus could hear the disbelief mixed with frustration. "You just show up and, what? Take us down? After everything we've been through?" The woman's eyes shifted toward Brad, her expression unreadable. "You were never meant to win, Brad," she said coldly. "This was never about you. This was about testing Marcus. A test that he failed, but one he's still crucial for." Marcus felt his blood run cold. Failed. He had failed. The words hit harder than the physical toll the fight had taken on him. He had trained for years, pushed himself to the limit, and yet none of it had mattered. This had been part of something bigger, something that had been planned before he ever stepped foot in that gym. "Test?" Marcus repeated, his voice a mixture of anger and confusion. "What kind of test? What the hell do you want from me?" For the first time, the woman's mask slipped, just a little. Her eyes darkened, and the edges of her mouth tightened. "We need you, Marcus, for something that's bigger than this fight, bigger than anything you could imagine." Brad stood up slowly, brushing himself off as he exchanged a brief glance with Marcus. His voice was low, but filled with disbelief. "And you think you can just recruit him? After all this?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the other figures who had entered the gym, signaling to them without a word. They moved in perfect unison, as if they were all part of the same operation, their eyes scanning the room with precision. Everything about them screamed control. "We've been watching you, Marcus," she said finally. "Your career, your victories, your losses. You're a symbol more than just a fighter. There are people who believe that you have the potential to be part of something that could change the world. Something bigger than the UFC, bigger than any single fight. But the real question is, are you willing to leave it all behind?" Marcus's head spun as the weight of her words hit him. This wasn't about proving himself in the ring anymore. It wasn't even about Brad or the fight they had just shared. It was about something far more dangerous, far more important. There were people watching him, people who had planned this all along. Brad let out a harsh laugh, his tone bitter. "You think he's just going to join you? After everything?" The woman didn't respond to him. Instead, she turned her attention back to Marcus. "You don't have to decide right now. We know you're confused. We know this isn't what you were expecting. But the truth is, Marcus, your role in this, your place in what's coming, is already set." The gym had gone eerily quiet, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life fighting, proving himself, always moving forward, always pushing past the limits. But now he had to decide what was next. Was he going to walk away from everything he knew, from the life that had defined him, or would he step into a new world, one that would forever alter the course of his life? Brad's voice cut through the silence again, a sharp edge to it. "So what happens now? What do you do with us?" The woman's gaze hardened. "For now you're both free to go. But remember, Marcus, this is just the beginning. The next phase starts when you're ready." There was a finality in her tone that left no room for argument. As she gestured toward the door, her colleagues moved to the side, creating a path for Marcus and Brad to exit. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one a different possibility, a different path. He glanced at Brad, who was still catching his breath, his face a mixture of relief and confusion. They both knew this wasn't just a simple fight anymore. Something far bigger was at play. As Marcus stepped toward the door, his legs still aching from the injury, he paused, looking back at the woman. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Her response was cryptic but direct. "When you're ready to leave the past behind, when you're ready to fight for something more, we'll be waiting." And with that, she turned, disappearing into the shadows with her team, leaving Marcus standing in the middle of the gym, his thoughts scattered, his future uncertain. As the door closed behind him, Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The fight had ended, but his journey was far from over. What lay ahead was a new kind of battle, one that had nothing to do with punches or submissions. But no matter what came next, Marcus knew one thing for sure. He was about to step into a world that would test him in ways he had never imagined. And the real fight was just beginning.